Hello, everyone. Welcome in. In this video, we are going to be discussing how we are past the deadline for the New Mexico Supreme Court to have made a decision about the evidence and the suppression in the Alexee Trevizo case. I don't want anyone to be alarmed because even though the decision didn't come out right on the deadline, the New Mexico Supreme Court does go year round. And so a decision is still in the works. It doesn't mean that anything has happened or that the case is over or anything of that nature. All it means is that, kind of like we've predicted here on this channel, they are going to have to go through this evidence and the statutes regarding the privilege in New Mexico with a fine-tooth comb. They're going to have to precisely apply privilege at points where it should apply to uphold the precedent of privilege for other patients, and also be able to waive the privilege when necessary based on statements that may or may not be in furtherance of a crime that were made to the healthcare professionals that Alexee encountered that night. And we've said from the beginning that this would be a monumentous task. We've said very much so that there is a fair way to go through this evidence to basically uphold the precedent in the case law, not gut the privilege, and also not gut patients' rights based on what they have to do here. An important thing to note that the justices will have in mind, that those who think Alexee is guilty may not really care to hear, but it still doesn't really affect us negatively, is they do not want to impact other patients' rights negatively or allow some kind of new loophole or anything that can happen to your standard medical patient regarding their privilege due to what they allow in Alexee's case. And if there is any argument about the mind frame of seeking medical attention or not, depending on the timeline, there is essentially a balance that needs to happen so that the proper statements that apply to the exception can be applied in this case and not hurt any other medical patient's privilege in the state. So with that, if there is any question at certain times, such as arriving to the hospital before a crime was allegedly committed, was Alexee potentially seeking medical care? And up until a crime was committed, should privilege be applied to those statements? That's a question we've asked here on this channel to try and be fair to the evidence that does come in against Alexee Trevizo and the rights that are afforded in their state laws. So we've also questioned the time in the hospital room after everyone finds out that Alexee had just given birth and Alexee speaks with the doctor. Now, we disagree here based on the way that this was suppressed, because the district judge chose to suppress via Miranda, meaning that the doctor turned into a police officer, and that the suppression was upheld due to Miranda needing to be explained to Alexee before that conversation took place, which I find to be illogical, because I do think that that was the first actual honest and truthful conversation that Alexee potentially had with the medical provider, be it forced or not by the situation. Alexee was finally able to get the life-saving care that she needed based on the accurate medical diagnosis that Alexee was having, which was something to do with a pregnancy that was appearing to be full term. So with that, the Supreme Court is weighing a lot in this case, and they're going to want to make sure they have everything right. And as we pointed out here, there was a lot of factual errors that the district judge leaned on. So essentially, this is being looked at completely de novo, completely new, not only on the ideas and the suppression behind the legal philosophy, but also the facts in this case. Because in my last video, we questioned heavily, what did the judge actually rely on when making these findings of fact and making this suppression order? So with that, we have to get on the table that the Supreme Court's delay is actually looking very good for us, because that means that they did not just uphold the blanket suppression that the district court judge did with all of this evidence. That means there will be evidence that comes back to the state in this case. That means not every single thing is going to stay suppressed. It also means some stuff will likely stay suppressed unless, after them dissecting every square inch down to the millimeter of this case, maybe a majority of it comes back based on the law. I wanted to do something for us, since we're going to obviously be waiting a little bit longer. I wanted to do something for us that would maybe give us an idea as to the philosophies behind these justices and what we may expect to come. So data was gathered based on the last around 2 years of decisions made by these justices to gather their different philosophies, the different ways they rule, if they're typically pro-state, pro-defense, pro-defendant, pro-plaintiff, depending on what issues being looked at, and what the likelihood of their decision may be on this evidence. And then based on that, we have some interesting information as to what the data says will come when we get this order back from the Supreme Court about the suppression. So with that, we're going to jump into what we found about each of these judges, their temperament, how they treat both sides, and then we'll get into what the data says about what will be returned and still suppressed in this decision that will come from the Supreme Court here. All right, so let's take a look at these justices. We have Chief Justice Bacon, moderate, slight defense tilt, leans towards rights protections, especially for vulnerable populations, a strong textualist, but context aware, emphasizes procedural fairness and transparency, cautious with law enforcement errors, detail oriented, and big on, quote, public trust in the judiciary. Chief Thompson, moderate, defense friendly, strong pro individual rights, more policy oriented, so pragmatic textualism, tends to scrutinize confessions and custodial issues carefully, concerned with power imbalance, uses social context language. Justice Vargas, moderate, slight defense tilt, generally pro-rights, but balances public safety. Balanced textualist, thoughtful, prefers incremental change, often frames decisions in a, quote, justice for all language, cautious about expanding state powers. Justice Vigil, moderate, defense favorable, strong rights emphasis, historically defense friendly, policy driven textualist, most vocal about expanding constitutional protections under New Mexico law, historically more willing to reverse convictions or suppress evidence to protect procedural rights. He's probably our most dangerous person on this list. Justice Zamora, balanced to slightly state-leaning, balances carefully, cautious about extending new rights too broadly, more literal textualists, slightly conservative in statutory readings, seen as a swing vote, emphasizes legislative intent, sometimes sides with state in close procedural disputes. So based on this, we have a little bit of a breakdown, and we see a little bit of defense tilt, defense favorable, and defense friendly on quite a few of these. But as you go through the rest of the explanation of their temperament when they are making these decisions, how they form these decisions, they do want procedural fairness, transparency. They also have things like balancing public safety. They have thoughtful, prefers incremental changes, which for things like that would be important, because essentially to continue to uphold this blanket privilege suppression that the district judge has, you would have to not be in favor of an incremental change little by little by little. You would just do away with exception D4. So that's not great. But this justice does, Justice Vargas, the one that applies to, does have a lot of things in our favor, despite having slight defense tilt. You also see moderate on there for them as well, which means they're not very defense favorable. They're just cautious about defendants' rights. And if we think logically about the rights at stake in this case, there is a very logical way to give back the evidence to the state that is necessary, pertinent, and allowed, and also maintain the precedent of the very high standard that New Mexico seems to have for their medical privilege. But they also have a very well-defined, very well carved out exception to the rule 11504D4. We have said it here until we just can't even see straight anymore. We know this rule inside and out, and we know the exceptions inside and out. And essentially, that is what we are hanging our hat on in this case to get most of these statements admitted. And we'll go in deep a little further after we get through the next couple slides as to, after this data analysis, what we really think may come from this decision. Here we have what they are most likely to do based on the data we have about these justices. So Chief Justice Bacon, likely to push for procedural clarity, partial approach. Justice Thomas, strong scrutiny of the custodial context, may favor partial suppression but not blanket. Justice Vargas, likely to propose a middle ground surgical solution. Justice Vigil, might favor suppression on privilege grounds but carefully parsed, not a full blanket. Justice Zamora, more state-leaning, might oppose broad suppression, could accept states' partial admission approach. What this basically says is there will still be statements and evidence returned to the state. It's just going to be surgically curated before it's given back. And that's what we have said for 2 years on this channel, when we knew that there was, the defense was going to file these motions for suppressing this evidence. And then once it was granted, we knew that in this whole time, the smart way to have done this is to properly apply the privilege when necessary, and also try and make sure that we don't overreach with what we are using against a defendant. And I've been very clear about trying to preserve the conviction that will come potentially for appeal. We don't want to use too much evidence that it could potentially hurt the case in the long run, when it is almost inevitably, in my opinion, going to be appealed if a guilty verdict is returned, especially on the murder one charge. So with that, I don't want to use more evidence than we need. And I have long thought about it. As we've all seen, we have a long time and even a little more to go. I've long thought about how ominous it would be for the defense when the trial essentially starts at Alexee getting unhooked and going to the bathroom. And then it ends once you see the hospital staff finding baby Alex, tending to baby Alex, and calling his time of death eventually. So with that is very ominous. It doesn't give you much of anything for Alexee. If anything, her statements could try to help her, could try to poke holes in what the state is saying. I think it's actually much more dangerous for the defense to not have some of the things that Alexee said entered. With that, who knows what exactly will come from the Supreme Court, but based on all of this data, we have a hypothesis here, a prediction. Here is the best theory, hypothesis, prediction as to what will be coming, I'm sure very soon, from the Supreme Court regarding the decision for this evidence. Number one, they're very likely to reject the blanket suppression, which we have long said here. 11504D4, the exception, does account for some of these statements to be allowed in, which I will get to as we get through this list. They will fix the factual errors, which is probably why this is taking so long, because not only is this a very important decision, but I'm not trying to be rude or disrespectful to the district judge here in any way. They weren't given a very clean slate to work with. It's all kind of like, it's like a folder with all the papers sticking out in every which way and not in order, because the judge just didn't really parse through any of this. And some of it's not factually correct in the findings of fact that we found in the last video. We pointed out that some of those things are just not right according to the body cam. And so we will potentially see, based on this prediction, the factual errors being fixed. The next thing is possibly suppress only targeted statements, which is an interesting way that this came out, how that's worded. Essentially, it falls in line with trying to only apply statements that are around the time of the crime that can be honestly and not prejudicially applied to Alexee's trial. We don't want anything that is more prejudicial than probative getting in there, because again, we want to preserve appeal issues. If we get a conviction, we want it to stick. We don't want issues based on the evidence. And so the fact that it's saying it will suppress things, but only very targeted statements, I think is quite interesting. I've had my theories as to which statements may or may not be suppressed, and we'll get to that here in 1 second, because this next part is very interesting. Leaving Rosa's statements in. That's odd that the data came through with all that information, and it says it's very possible that Rosa's statements are going to stay in. That is interesting, because that seems to me to think that based on the facts that this had and the information on basically the facts of the case and the information on the justices, there's two possible outcomes that could happen for Rosa's statements. The obvious, they either are suppressed along with Alexee's, which doesn't really make sense, but the district judge seemed to be leaning towards the ability to suppress Rosa's statements under all of this big umbrella that they put on this suppression, or they're not suppressed, and it doesn't matter if Alexee's statements are privileged or not. The only reason this would matter is if the statements Alexee makes in the hospital room in front of the police officers stays suppressed on Miranda, because there could be an issue with attempting to get statements in that are on police body cam if they were essentially not supposed to be there, not supposed to be investigating, and the defendant was supposed to be Mirandized at that point. There could be issues with allowing in Rosa's statements in the hospital room, which are some very, very damning statements. One would think you may want those in there. And so what's interesting is that Rosa's statements and Rosa's presence in general is what should have waived the medical privilege from the get-go, because one could say that Rosa could have told anyone anything that happened in that hospital room the entire time since the night in question. She could have flipped on Alexee and told all. She inherently breaks the privilege, but the privilege was essentially applied, and then the Miranda was applied, and Rosa's just kind of been, swept up in all of that. But when it comes to the statements in the hospital room, if Rosa's statements are allowed in and she's not found to have any suppression applied to her statements, no privilege, doesn't fall under the Miranda or the medical privilege, then we have some interesting conversations to be had about what Rosa's options on the stand actually are when being basically examined by the state. They can try and rehab on cross-exam, but If all of Rosa's statements are allowed in, this is a very rough trial for Rosa specifically. Uphold clear statutory crime fraud exceptions. Now, this is interesting because 11504D4, the exception to the privilege rule, would be what this is referencing. If it's very clear that any statements made regarding potential child abuse to an otherwise privileged person have happened, they are not privileged and can be used as evidence. So, if they are basically predicting that the exception is going to be upheld, it's starting to look exactly like how the pieces that I was figuring may be on this board when it comes to the evidence for this trial, it may be more and more likely, because there are some very clear times that it should not be privileged information because of the potential crime that happened. And there's other times where it is questionable, and I'd like to preserve issues for appeal so that we don't have a conviction overturned. I'd like a clean conviction because I do think this is a very important case. Really quick, I think it is important to focus in on Rosa's statements being left in, because everyone has focused so much on Alexee's statements and what the hospital has or hasn't said to Alexee about, did they tell her she was pregnant? Is she not pregnant? Alexee said that nothing was breathing and all of these things, when the most important statements come from Rosa, in my opinion. Rosa's statements are very hard for the defense to get over if these statements are left in. So when all the data came back and it ran everything and it said that Rosa's statements really shouldn't be impacted, that Rosa's statements should stay allowed in, that was affirming of a very, shall I say, lethal way forward for the state to proceed to trial. It is not good for the defense if Rosa's statements, all of them, are allowed in, which, if the Miranda suppression doesn't hold up and anything is suppressed in the hospital room based off medical privilege, it really wouldn't apply to Rosa in any way, and it wouldn't be that quote unquote fruit of the poisonous tree, something that could potentially, even though you could argue it in, might hurt you in the long run, right? So if we're preserving issues for appeal, if there's no Miranda applied to those statements, rather medical privilege applied in any way to the statements made by Alexee in the hospital room in front of the police officers, which I find to be more logical. If you're going to apply privilege, the statements would have to be suppressed under medical privilege, not Miranda being necessary, because custody, I just don't see it getting there. But I could understand this being the first real and true medical conversation Alexee had with her doctor. And if you felt the need to suppress it under that, I could understand. I think that having those statements suppressed under the medical suppression for just Alexee is very beneficial for the state, because no one would get to re-enter those statements. But if Rosa's statements are left in, we are left with, I just asked you to tell me the truth, being allowed in. Imagine that. Imagine Rosa on the stand having to account for the moment she said that.
I just asked you, baby, to tell me the truth.
She all but confirms that Alexee was denying her pregnancy in some way, was concealing a secret. And it also potentially lends to the idea that Rosa may have had some kind of suspicion that something was going on further than back pain, constipation, all the things that have been alleged that Alexee said that she was experiencing that night, that Rosa also has very contradicting actions and statements based upon that night. We'll touch on that really quick before we get into the rest of the other statements and actions. Rosa brought Alexee to the hospital for alleged back pain that was really bad. But when the police, or well, the detective at this point, is talking to Rosa and the boyfriend and Alexee's stepfather, the boyfriend's mother, in the waiting room, Rosa talks about how Alexee has had these issues constantly. This is a common thing for Alexee. She has back pain, hip pain, and Rosa throws out there the idea that something had happened physically, an assault on Rosa while she was pregnant with Alexee, and it caused some kind of spinal issue for Alexee.
What did she come here for that she told you?
She told me she had back pain.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay. Has she been having back pain before?
Yeah, pain for her and her hips is no, I mean, she was born with like her, I don't know, it's like crooked.
Her spine?
Okay, because my ex-husband, he hit me. He beat me whenever I was pregnant with her. So she was early. So, she had some problems with her hips. Like, I always had to take her to the chiropractor to get adjusted because she couldn't use, like, she was always getting constipated. Like, she had to get lined up, whatever.
Either way, all that matters is that Rosa makes it seem as though this is a common instance, but this time it was really bad, so they brought her to the hospital in the middle of the night. With that, the other kind of odd and contradictory statement that happens is when Rosa says, I just asked you to tell me the truth, but she also says down at the bottom to the detectives, I had no idea she was pregnant.
Well, this time, I didn't know. I honestly didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know.
Seems a bit odd to have been wanting some kind of truth to come from Alexee, but have no idea she could possibly be pregnant. I wonder what truth Rosa was actually looking for from Alexee in that moment if it wasn't about pregnancy. If all these statements are allowed in, Rosa will likely be asked that on the stand. We can go back up to the top because this is one of the most damning pieces of evidence because we already know it's going to be allowed in and it can't be suppressed. Rosa can try to account for it, but it won't be easy. It'll look mad suspicious when Rosa shows up about 40 seconds after Alexee shuts that bathroom door. If someone's just experiencing pretty bad back pain and hip pain and constipation, which is normal for them, and according to what Rosa allegedly knew at the time, Alexee just said that she finally had to have a bowel movement. So why the rush to the bathroom to make sure she's okay? For a bowel movement? That seems a bit odd. It's also a bit odd because many people have implied that Rosa is the reason Alexee hid her pregnancy. And I've taken heat because I actually disagree with that opinion. I can not really like Rosa's temperament and demeanor. Could probably assume I don't really like her as a person potentially, without having to say that I think that she is the reason Alexee did what she did. In fact, when you see the clip of Rosa laughing off the conversation about the conception of baby Alex, you begin to wonder if she really did care if Alexee was sexually active or not. We know Alexee had at some point had birth control, at least according to Alexee's statements. So when Rosa laughs it off.
And how long have you all been together?
Almost 2 years.
2 years? Okay. So I'm not trying to be rude, but you are more than likely would be the father? Okay.
Yes. No, we get it. We get
Sometimes it happens.
How are we really supposed to imply that Rosa had a problem that Alexee could have gotten pregnant? It doesn't give that vibe for me. The last thing on this list is one that's hard to work around, but it has a lot of suspicious things that are tied to it, and that's the phentermine that was found in baby Alex's system. We also have the statement by Alexee, what if I stopped taking birth control and started taking weight loss or diet medication?
She did at one point in time when the ultrasound tech was in the room with her ask if there was anything. She pretty much said, would there be any like bad outcomes if she had stopped taking one medication and stopped taking another. And I said, well, what medications are you talking about? She said, well, what would happen if I stopped taking birth control and started taking weight loss medications? And I was like, I don't know.
It's an odd question.
I thought so.
With that, we do know that a lot of caffeine and phentermine were found in baby Alex's system, two things that are not supposed to be in a baby's system at birth, if at all, right? And so one has to question, with phentermine being a prescription drug that's usually not given to teens, despite maybe not being a minor, 18 or 19 is not the typical age that someone is getting prescribed phentermine. And you have to remember this was kind of before the big Ozempic weight loss thing that's been happening recently. And so phentermine is pretty regulated in the United States. And I've wondered why the doctor who gave Alexee phentermine isn't named in a lawsuit, because that's definitely one thing that could have hurt baby Alex that Alexee shouldn't have been taking due to being pregnant. Yet I don't see a wrongful death lawsuit launched at the doctor who gave phentermine to Alexee, only the doctor who found baby Alex and pronounced him dead, which is very odd because you'd wonder who in Alexee's direct circle could even get her phentermine. Could it be Rosa? Will she potentially have to answer to that on the stand if the state wants to ask her questions about if she could be the one who supplied phentermine to Alexee? It is possible. Obviously, all of these breakdowns of the justices and the theory, the prediction as to what may come is not solid. It's not set in stone. This is data that's been compiled, ran through a system, and then eventually gave us this information. I was willing to share it because it was given valid information, it was trained on the correct facts, and it came out with a pretty well-reasoned analysis. And that's usually what you're looking for. Despite something being very emotionally, charging, it could be something that could make you feel it needs to be one way or another. But to have an honest analysis that, even though these are somewhat defense leaning, though moderate, very cautious and rights forward justices, which is something I can be, I can approve of, I can be in support of. Even though we have that, we still have a well-reasoned idea behind getting this evidence actually sorted, as this gave, like how this put it, was surgically, precisely given back to us with the proper pieces taken out and fixing what was left a mess for them, in my opinion, and giving us a very well-functioning guide and map as to how this trial should play out. Of course, we're still assuming there's a trial. If a lot of this evidence comes back, who knows what kind of potential plea could come from this. My heart has always said that they won't plead, that they will take their chances at trial. Team Trevizo isn't going to settle. I don't know if there's anything that could convince them to settle, but depending on how this evidence is returned, oh man, would it be time to start looking at something other than trying to take this to trial, trying to fess up to something here and try and get a deal. Just my lowly opinion over here, my lowly paralegal opinion, because man, it already looks bad with what I know we have. If we were to go to trial for the defense, they're having an uphill battle. They have to really convince that there is a valid reason Alexee never opened that door and asked for help, a valid reason that Alexee never pulled that help cord. They have to really convince a jury that the reason that door stayed shut wasn't to ensure that baby Alex died, and that given it more time, Alexee would have cleaned up the scene even more potentially. These are the things that the jury may think and imply from the situation. The fact that Alexee was in there cleaning for however long and hoping no one would find baby Alex potentially won't look good to the jury. That looks a lot like intent to kill baby Alex. You're stuck trying to prove that baby Alex didn't look alive to Alexee, despite an autopsy very much indicating baby Alex was alive. There's not just one sign of life. There's multiple little signs here and there that say this was a live-born baby. You now have to convince everyone that he was live, but not to Alexee. They have a very uphill battle at trial. Very uphill battle. And the investigation was much more solid than it happened to be for a lot of other cases that people maybe felt similarly about, which would be like Casey Anthony, Brooke Skylar Richards, these cases that some people don't really like the outcome because they feel there was more intent and more sinister actions than actually got punished for, I could say. I don't want Casey Anthony to come after me. I've heard she's litigious, so we all know you were found not guilty on the big one, so don't come after us over here. But in Alexee's case, I do think that it doesn't have similar qualities that can allow Alexee to get off on this technicality in the way that people may feel about those other cases regarding abuse of child, especially infants or young toddlers. People don't like that, and technicalities do happen, and it very much feels like that for the other cases. That investigation for Brooke Skylar Richards, the autopsy, the ME took back their findings, which had caused a weird confession already from the defendant. So everything was fumbled there, and the defendant got off pretty lucky because of it. And they just didn't have the evidence they needed in Casey Anthony's case to prove what everyone really felt in their guts that she likely did, right? And so that's not really how it'll go in this case, in my opinion. I think that the evidence is solid that we'll get back the autopsy, the hallway footage, the implied intent based on the surrounding circumstances, how Alexee didn't tell anyone anything after leaving the bathroom, how Alexee never asked for help for baby Alex. All of those things imply the intent for careless disregard for baby Alex's life, if not intent that baby Alex would not make it, that no one could save baby Alex because saving him was a pull cord or opening of the door away. Thank you so much if you made it this far in this video. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please leave them down below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And I do genuinely enjoy the conversation. If you're interested in following cases like the Alexee Trevizo case of child, please subscribe as I'll be covering it all along the way with a legal focus. It's your Friday. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.